Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Real Talk seminar. We're so excited to have you here today. We're going to go over a couple of logistics, and then we're going to get right back into it. First, our agenda. We're going to go through some introductions, some norms for our conversation, and then get right into the case studies.
Okay, we'll do introductions once we get to our breakout room since we're such a big group today. But to introduce Real Talk is an organization that Divya and I started a little over a year ago to give high school students the opportunity to participate in discussion about politics and also to build the skills to become more engaged and informed citizens. And so we also do work in areas like media literacy, and we host conversations like these. So thank you so much for joining us today. I know a lot of you are already involved in Real Talk, but for those of you who aren't, definitely stick around at the end for more information. So
we wanted to begin today with some norm setting. And we wanted to break this into two different categories, purpose and possibility. And we really appreciate this framework from Stacey Crispin and Allison Park, two people who have worked really closely with our school, Castellea, to talk about how we have conversations with race. And so the first is the purpose of our conversation today, and it's to think critically and engage in some active discussion surrounding race on college campuses, and specifically how people in leadership positions reacted and how we define free versus hate speech. And the next is that inherent to that purpose is the possibility of us making mistakes. And in the forefront of our conversations, we have to understand that.
We wanted to introduce, in addition to what Divya just shared, an acronym that we've developed for Real Talk and some guidelines that we like to keep in mind during our conversations. The acronym is Real Talk, and it starts with raise thoughtful questions. When someone says something you disagree with, or you're looking to understand more about what someone thinks before you respond, always raise questions first. The second is embrace discomfort, and this is especially prevalent in discussions that are more challenging, like those about race, like we're going to have today. So keep in mind there will be moments where you're uncomfortable, and that's okay. This is a place of learning, and by embracing that discomfort, we're all going to grow. The A is for act with humility. As Divya said, we will make mistakes, and that's okay. It's always okay in this space to admit when you made a mistake, to fix it. And on the other end, be sure to assume best intentions, because everybody is here because they want to learn. And so we can create a good dynamic by assuming best intentions and admitting our mistakes. L is pretty straightforward, listen openly. T, think critically about your sources. A, advocate with confidence. If someone says something you disagree with, definitely bring up an alternative perspective, as long as you do so in a respectful way. And if there's a perspective that isn't shared in the room that you want to bring up, even if it's not one that that represents your perspective, this is a space where you can do that. L is learn from many perspectives. So hopefully through the framing of this discussion, there are a lot of perspectives in the room, but always bring up more perspectives again, as I said, for advocate. And K is for know yourself. And before we start, I want to position Divya and I in this conversation. I want to position myself and Divya in this conversation. Know yourself is about understanding your position in the room. And while Divya and I have planned this discussion, we're in high school, we're your peers. We will make mistakes too. Don't be afraid to let us know if there's something you would change. That's our position in this conversation.
And on that point, we want to talk a little bit about what it means to acknowledge positionality, which is, in a sense, when you're coming into the conversation, knowing yourself and knowing the different parts of your identity that give you and don't give you privilege. So that means speaking from the I perspective, speaking from your experience when you're creating your comments. It means addressing what we like to call the core cultural identifiers, your race, your education, your ability, and having that be at the forefront of your mind when you're making your comments. And so we've offered a couple of questions here you can use as you start to think about this, like what parts of your identity give you privilege, and how might your perspective be limited because of that? Yeah, and with that, we're going to move on to case studies.
I'm going to be a rising junior, but I also go to Castellea. And why doesn't Ella go next?
I'm Ella. I'm a rising sophomore, and I'm going to Castellia next year. Ella, you want to go? Oh.
Ella, do you want to go? Oh, sorry. Okay. I can call on someone next then. Bella, do you want to go?
I'm Bella. I'm a rising sophomore and I go to Sacred Heart Prep, which is also in the Bay Area. Sophia.
I'm Sophia and I'm a rising senior at Sacred Heart Prep.
Natasha, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Natasha. I'm a rising senior at Harker, which is also in the Bay Area.
Okay, I guess I'll just call on people. Annika.
I'm Annika, and I'm going to 8th grade at Menlo, which is also in the Bay Area.
April.
Hi, my name is April. I'm a rising junior, and I go to school at Harker, which is also in the Bay Area.
Chris.
Hi, my name is Chris Donnelly. I go to Menlo School, which is also in the Bay Area, and I'm a rising 9th grader or freshman.
Okay, who did we miss? Max, have you gone?
I have not gone, no. Hi, I'm Max. I go to Menlo and I'm going to be a freshman next year.
Okay, perfect. Nia, did we get to you?
No. Hi, my name is Orania, but like Eliza said, you can call me Nia. And I'm actually all the way on the opposite side of the US. I'm from Boston, Massachusetts. I go to Boston Latin School, and I am a rising junior.
Okay, perfect. So in this breakout room, the case study that we're going to be talking about is about Halloween costumes and an incident that happened at Yale a couple years ago. And so the basic facts of what happened were is that the Yale Intercultural Affairs Committee sent an email to the entire student body leading up to Halloween and encouraging students to be really thoughtful and think critically about the costumes that they wear and the effect that their costume might have on classmates. And so some students thought that these leaders shouldn't have provided guidance on attire, Halloween attire, because they felt like the guidelines were infantilizing. And in response, this professor, Erica Christakis, who is a lecturer in early child education and head of one of the residential colleges, responded with an email to the students in her residential college, posing questions about whether the school should have issued guidance on costumes, which ended up being hugely controversial. And so what we're going to do is we're first going to read the initial email from the Intercultural Affairs Committee, then we're going to read Erica's response, and then we'll watch a video of the students who responded. And I've prepared a bunch of discussion questions, but really this is flexible. We can talk about whatever you guys think is interesting from the letter. Here is the Google Doc. I'll put it in the chat with the 2 letters. And then maybe what we can do is just go around and everybody read a paragraph. And so if you're comfortable with reading, maybe use the hand raise feature. I can see who's raising their hand. And I'll just call on people to switch off every paragraph. Okay, so starting with the first email, is there anyone who wants to read, or I can just cold call people? Okay, April, go ahead.
Dear Yale students, the end of October is quickly approaching, and along with the falling leaves and cooler nights come the Halloween celebrations on our campus and in our community. These celebrations provide opportunities for students to socialize as well as make positive contributions to our community and the New Haven community as a whole. Some upcoming events include Haunted Hall Crawl and Costume Ball at Yale Peabody Museum of Natural History, Grove Street Cemetery Tours, Grove Street Cemetery, New Haven, YSO's Halloween Show, Woodsley Hall. Should I stop?
Yeah, that's perfect. Bella, do you want to read? I guess I am just going to cold call people. Sorry, guys.
However, Halloween is also unfortunately a time when the normal thoughtfulness and sensitivity of most Yale students can sometimes be forgotten, and some poor decisions can be made, including wearing feathered headdresses, turbans, wearing war paint, or modifying skin tone, or wearing blackface or redface. These same issues and examples of cultural appropriation and or misrepresentation are increasingly surfacing with representations of Asians and Latinos.
Okay, Annika, do you want to read the next part?
Yeah. Yale is a community that values free expression as well as inclusivity. And while students, undergraduate and graduate, definitely have a right to express themselves, we would hope that people would actively avoid those circumstances that threaten our sense of community or disrespects, alienates or ridicules segments of our population based on race, nationality, religious belief, or gender expression.
Ella, do you want to read the next part?
The culturally unaware or insensitive choices made by some members of our community in the past have not just been directed towards a cultural group, but have impacted religious beliefs, Native American/Indigenous people, socioeconomic strata, Asians, Hispanic/Latino, women, Muslims, etc. In many cases, the student wearing the costume has not intended to offend, but their actions or lack of forethought have sent a far greater message than any apology could after the fact.
Okay, Chris, do you want to finish up this letter?
Sure. There is growing national concern on campuses everywhere about these issues, and we encourage Yale students to take the time to consider the costumes and the impact it may have. So if you are planning to dress up for Halloween or will be attending any social gatherings planned for the weekend, please ask yourself these questions before deciding upon your costume choice. Wearing a funny costume, is that humor based on making fun of real people, human traits, or cultures? Wearing a historical costume, if this costume is meant to be historical, does it further misinformation or historical and cultural inaccuracies? Wearing a cultural costume, does this costume reduce cultural differences to jokes or stereotypes? And then wearing a religious costume, does this costume mock or belittle someone's deeply held faith / tradition? Could someone take offense with your costume, and why? Should I continue, or is that?
It's okay. We can finish the letter there, but that was perfect. So now that you've read this letter, and we'll read the other one too, and I have many more questions about that, but just to start off, what are some different ways that this letter might be interpreted by students? I think there are like two obvious perspectives, but are there, maybe if we can make a list of 3 or 5 to start off the conversation. And then if you want to share, why don't we start with, feel free to just unmute yourself and jump in. And then if that doesn't work, we can start doing the hand raising.
I think one of the ways that you could see it was like, it was really thoughtful, because a lot of people who are affected by cultural appropriation, like they could be really hurt by the costume choices. So the school's like taking necessary precautions for that. And so it was really thoughtful that you could, or like one way to see it was that it was really thoughtful.
Yeah, Shoshi, go ahead.
I think, yeah, and then also, obviously, I don't see it this way, but I think the way it was probably interpreted by some students was that it was like the university saying things that they didn't have a right to say and kind of infringing on those rights to like expression and costumes and, you know, that kind of thing.
I was thinking back to what the first person said was that the letter of this was very thoughtful, because not only did it acknowledge that sometimes these students don't necessarily have the knowledge or necessarily the intent. I think that's the way they phrased it, the intent to offend the individual, which is very important on the other part of acknowledgement. It doesn't seem that there are serious repercussions, but knowing and ensuring this when a school population still has a majority of around almost 50% of white students, is very important, you know, when it comes to affecting, because we're talking about Yale University specifically.
Yeah, that's a great piece of additional context. Does anybody else have an opinion on this letter? Okay, so what do you guys think about the guidelines? What are the benefits and drawbacks of the schools providing guidance? Do you think this email was appropriate? Is there anything you would change about it? Do you have any general thoughts?
I think it was like pretty like culturally sensitive. Like it talked about like they didn't say it was like necessarily bad to wear like a funny hot costume or historical costume, and the way they phrased it, like they made it seem that only if it's offensive to someone else should you not be wearing this. But if you're trying to like preserve this culture and like preserve like, I don't know, like history or something, then in that case it is okay. Yeah. So like I think like they were pretty, they put, it's clear they put like what other people said, it was clear they put thought into this letter.
Yeah, what I like about this letter is that it's not extremely general. Like, they laid out what they didn't want and what they did want. Like, and they gave you a Pinterest board to like look into. I liked that part.
Yeah, what I appreciated was that it drew a line between offensive and trying to represent history. And there are some conflations there because often history has offensive context. And you know, we're seeing that with today with tearing down these Confederate statues, and people seem to not be able to, and you know, it's very subjective, but people seem to be unable to differentiate between offensive and representative of history. And I appreciate the way that they kind of drew a line between what they think is offensive and what they think is just accurately representing what history says happened.
Yeah, those are all really great points. And I'll provide one, like there's another opportunity if you want to share more about what you thought. But one thing I really liked about this letter was that it was signed by the heads of a bunch of cultural centers on campus. And so it really represented the range of identities that are represented on campus. So if anybody has a last comment about that, feel free to jump in now, but otherwise we'll move on to the next email, which is the much more controversial one. Okay, so the next email was written by Erica Christakis. She's a lecturer at Yale, and she is what they call master or dean of a residential college, along with her husband Nicholas, who she references in the letter. And so we'll do the same thing where you can just volunteer to read a paragraph and we can go through the letter. Annika, do you want to start?
Sorry, I'm making Dear Salamander, students of a residential college, Nicholas and I have heard from a number of students who are frustrated by the mass emails sent to the student body about appropriate Halloween wear. I've always found Halloween an interesting embodiment of more general adult worries about young children. As some of you may be aware, I teach a class on the concept of the problem child, and I was speaking with some of my students yesterday about the ways in which Halloween, traditionally a day of subversion for children and young people, is also an occasion for adults to exert their control.
Shoshi, do you want to read the next part?
When I was young, adults were freaked out by the specter of Halloween candy poisoned by lunatics or spiked with razor blades, despite the absence of a single recorded case of such an event. Now we've grown to fear the sugary candy itself. And this year, we seem afraid that college students are unable to decide how to dress themselves on Halloween.
Natasha, do you want to read the next?
I don't wish to trivialize genuine concerns about cultural and personal representation and other challenges to our lived experience in a plural community. I know that many decent people have proposed guidelines on Halloween costumes from a spirit of avoiding hurt and offense. I laud these goals in theory, as most of us do, but in practice, I wonder if we should reflect more transparently as a community on the consequences of an institutional, which is to say, bureaucratic and administrative exercise of implied control over college students.
Samina, do you want to read the next part?
Yeah, sure. It seems to me that we can have this discussion of costumes on many levels. We can talk about complex issues of identity, free speech, cultural appropriation, and virtual signaling. But I wanted to share my thoughts with you from a totally different angle, as an educator concerned with the developmental stages of childhood and young adulthood.
Okay. Just to add, the parts that are in blue are because those are the parts I have questions about. So it's just a note for me, but that doesn't really mean anything. April, do you want to read the next paragraph?
As a former preschool teacher, for example, it's hard for me to give credence to a claim that there is something objectionably appropriate about a blonde-haired child wanting to be Milan for a day. Pretend play is the foundation of most cognitive tasks, and it seems to me that we want to be in the business of encouraging the exercise of imagination, not constraining it. I suppose we could agree that there's a difference between fantasizing about an individual character versus appropriating a culture, wholesale, the latter, which could be seen as tacky, offensive, genuine, hurtful, take or pick. But then I wonder, what is the statute of limitations on dreaming of dressing as Tiana the Frog Princess if you aren't a black girl from New Orleans? It's okay if you're 8, but not 18. I don't know the answer to these questions. They seem unanswerable, or at the least, they put us on slippery terrain that I, for one, prefer not to cross.
Max, do you want to read the next part?
Sure. Which is my point. I don't actually trust myself to foist my Halloween standards and motives on others. I can't defend them anymore, then you could defend yours. Why do we dress up on Halloween anyway? Should we start explaining that too? I've always been a good mimic, and I enjoy accents. I love to travel too, and have been to every continent but Antarctica. When I lived in Bangladesh, I bought a sari because it was beautiful, even though I looked stupid in it and never wore it once. Am I fetishizing and appropriating others' cultural experiences? Probably, but I really, really like them too.
Sophia, go ahead.
Even if we could agree on how to avoid offense, and I'll note that no one around campus seems overly concerned about the offense taken by religiously conservative folks to skin-revealing costumes, I wonder, and I'm not trying to be provocative, is there no room anymore for a child or a young person to be a little bit obnoxious, a little bit inappropriate or provocative, or yes, offensive? American universities were once a safe space, not only for maturation, but also for a certain regressive or even transgressive experience. Increasingly, it seems they have become places of censure and prohibition. And the censure and prohibition come from above, not from yourselves. Are we all okay with this transfer of power? Have we lost faith in young people's capacity, in your capacity to exercise self-censure through social norming, and also in your capacity to ignore or reject things that trouble you? Sorry. I've lost the placing.
It's okay. There's only one sentence left. I'll read it and then pick someone else. We tend to view the shift from individual to institutional agency as a trade-off between libertarian versus liberal values. Liberal in the American, not European sense of the word. Bella, do you want to read the next part?
Sure. Nicholas, her husband and head of the residential college, says, if you don't like a costume someone is wearing, look away or tell them you're offended. Talk to each other. Free speech and the ability to tolerate offense are the hallmarks of a free and open society.
Nia, do you want to just finish the letter?
Sorry, I didn't unmute myself. But again, speaking as a child development specialist, I think there might be something missing in our discourse about the exercise of free speech, including how we dress ourselves on campus, and it is this. What does this debate about Halloween costumes say about our view of young adults, of their strength and judgment? In other words, whose business is it to control the forms of costumes of young people? Not mine, I know that. Happy Halloween. Yours sincerely, Erica.
Perfect. Okay, so Now I just want to ask you all, what are some things that stood out to you about this letter? Are there any points that like you guys want to talk about specifically? Or is there anything that surprised you, made you upset, uncomfortable, anything you agree with, disagree with, just any strong reactions you had to the letter?
I thought it was quite thoughtful, and I appreciated obviously the amount of effort she put into making this not offensive, but just more bringing out questions in our society. The one thing that her argument seems to inherently rely on, though, is the fact that college students are children, and I don't think that's the case at all. I believe that they're adults who are capable of forming their own decisions, and they understand the harm that their actions can take. So if you do something such as wearing blackface, I feel like you are not a child who doesn't understand the negative effects and negative context of that. You know what's happened with it in the past, and you're still choosing to offend a significant portion of your campus with it.
I would have to agree with Max. I think that I agree with, I was actually going to say the same thing about her describing them as young adults while they're all probably 18 or over. And I also think it's very interesting how a lot of her actually, I found that her tone throughout the actual letter was passive aggressive, as if the college was actually stealing the rights of their students, even though it's probable that they have a handbook where that most children sign, or most students sign at the beginning of their term, that describes the lack of use of offensive clothing, etc. So I think that her claims are based on hyperbole and generalization of what they were asking.
Samina, did you have a point?
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say, as controversial as this letter may seem, it actually brought up like a lot of interesting ideas, and one of them being this idea of the college campus being this place of like free speech, yet at the same time it's now becoming this idea of like censorship. And I connected back to like the UC Berkeley like free speech movement, and just this idea of like the free speech movement literally started at a college campus, and now we're having so many conversations about like censorship, which isn't a bad thing, but it's just interesting to see that comparison.
Yeah, that's great. Actually, Shoshi, I definitely want to call on you, but can I pose one question first? Okay, so I guess to add on to what Samina was saying, and actually Max and Chris's earlier comments, do you think that schools should have restrictions on what people should say? Because I think there's a very real tension between free speech on one hand, but also creating a place where students of all backgrounds feel like they belong and are part of the school community. And a lot of schools have restrictions. Some schools are, very clearly against restrictions and have spoken out about it. What do you think of the idea that academic spaces might have restrictions on speech? Shoshi, yeah, definitely go for it.
Okay, well, I don't really have a total answer to that question, but I kind of have like a thought to add on to it, which is like, if you guys think that there's a difference between doing something kind of like ideally prohibitive, like beforehand, like Yale did, and sending out this letter saying like, please don't do anything offensive, versus not saying anything and then simply punishing afterwards, and whether you think that one is more acceptable than the other. But that was just a question for you guys.
To respond to Eliza's question, like personally my beliefs like are kind of different, but like basically what the ACLU has ruled in regards to like KKK protest and their right to free speech is that it is protected by law, because like if you aren't actively hurting like, I don't know the specific reason, but like the ACLU has said that like KKK protests are like legal. But like personally what I feel is that like if you are making those kind of stances, even if you're not directly pointing at a specific individual, you're indirectly like hurting an entire community.
I also had a point that I wanted to talk about. It was mostly about the author herself. What I noticed is that she has a Greek name. I'm half Greek myself, half Greek and half Vietnamese. And I find that within Greek culture, we have a tendency to be very conservative towards our ideals. I know that the Greek costume, for example, like a Greek goddess or something, is very exemplified. Well, not exemplified, that wasn't a good word. More so, it's very like a common costume to use, and we don't have a tendency to view it as cultural appropriation because of our history in which our ideals of democracy have been idolized within the ideals of the United States, and then within our government, we've idealized the ideals of natural rights, and really the First Amendment was really established on the basis of being able to criticize the government and less so on an individual basis, which I think why now that's become more of a problem as our country has become extremely diverse, because the founding fathers didn't really have that intention in the first place. And I think that maybe having a regulation to this would be an important fact of the matter to establish. But according to the first clause, it's technically not against the law. And while districts themselves can impose safe spaces for students, I think one point that I did agree with is that emphasizing once you talked about the argument of, let's say, like a white girl wanting to be Mulan as a young girl, it's been noticed by scientists that kids can distinguish and have these prejudices installed from a young age based on what they learned from their parents. And so this sort of causes this mindset for them. It's like, oh, this is associated with Asian culture. And that can be interpreted as good, but it can also go in the opposite direction of stereotypes. I know for me, it's been very difficult for me trying to wear custom costumes for my own culture because I don't have a tendency to look like either culture. Well, some people just call me white, whereas in Asian culture, I'm looked as a white, and then Greek culture, I'm viewed as Vietnamese. And so if I want to wear ao dai, people don't want me to wear that, and it's seen as offensive. And I feel like focusing on the individual character and as a child might be important to distinguish. Like, it's on the character itself, not on the basis of her race, which is important to establish, because I feel like establishing anti-racist notions from a young age is still important to me personally. Sorry for the
No, I actually think that's really interesting and related to what Max and Chris were talking about earlier, which is, I think for a young child, like that is potentially the case, but by the time you're looking at college students, they're already 20. And so do you guys have any thoughts on what the distinction is? Because she's really looking, Erica, Professor Christakis is really looking at the situation from her role as she's an early childhood, I don't know, something about her role is something about child development. And so do you guys have any thoughts about how the dynamic of someone dressing up changes as they grow up, and if it ever becomes inappropriate, and at what point that is? Samina, go for it.
Yeah, I was going to say, I just want to say thank you so much. Is it Nia? Is that?
You can call me Nia.
Okay, Nia, for sharing, because I just realized, like, I dressed up as a Greek goddess when I was like 7 years old. And just this idea of like, when I was dressing up as a Greek goddess when I was 7, like, how would that have changed if I did it like this year, for example? And so I definitely think there is some sort of bias around age and cultural appropriation, which, I mean, I don't think there should be a Greek goddess costume, period. But it's definitely something interesting to analyze. Like, when is like the cutoff age, if that makes sense?
I also think it depends on the culture around you, right? I think and it also depends on your intent. Like, when I was 7, along with, I'm sure, half my grade, half the other boys in my grade, I dressed up as a ninja. And that was not in any way commentary on Japanese shinobi culture. I just wanted to dress up like a ninja because I thought that was cool. I think you could interpret it as appropriation, though, in the sense that, just like if somebody wore a inauthentic turban now, I'd be kind of frustrated with that. I think that there are some appropriations there. I think the question is, how much are the people viewing it going to take offense about it, and how much are you intending to actually make a statement, versus are you just trying to do something cool and interesting, right? Like, I'd be okay with somebody wearing an authentic turban because they think it's an interesting part of society, or even entirely unrelated, they think it's an interesting fashion statement. I wouldn't have any issue with that. But if they begin to appropriate it by saying, I'm now trying to impersonate a Hindu person, I become frustrated, because I don't feel like that. I feel like that's kind of a stereotype, and I feel like it's almost an insult to my culture, and I feel like that's something I wouldn't be okay with. So I think ultimately it depends on your intent and how you follow through with that intent afterwards.
Chris, I'm going to call on you only because you had your hand up before, and then Shoshi will come to you.
Max, thank you for sharing that. I agree with you. I'd also like to say that I think that this letter probably came out after there were several cases of like virtue signaling or like cultural appropriation, or obviously like disrespectful things that were happening. I think that they were, and I also think that they were probably complaints. And if students are old enough to feel hurt by such things, I don't think that other students should have the freedom to wear whatever they want at the same time if it's going to hurt their peers. And I think that should be the cutoff. If like a student is hurt by certain cultural appropriation, I think it's time to kind of stricten the boundaries slightly, like the parameters.
Yeah, I agree. I think there are certain costumes that are very clearly inappropriate. In the letter, she cites blackface as one of them, and I think that's definitely like far past the line. I hope we can all agree on that. Shoshi, do you want to share your comment?
Yeah, I just thought it was interesting. Max, I think you brought up like the idea of intent as an important factor. And I guess I'm not really sure, like I agree with it somewhat, but I'm also not completely sure, just because I think that's why this idea of cultural appropriation has become really, not like a heated discussion, but it's become like a popular term because we don't, like it's, a lot of people use it differently these days. But anyway, that's kind of unrelated. But what I was gonna say about the intent is that like, I feel like when, like, because you have an intent, it might change the way that like someone of the culture, like if I'm wearing some costume and the person of that culture is offended by it, but then I explain the intent, it might change things. But I think it's also about the message that you're putting out there to others, maybe even of my culture rather than the culture that I'm wearing. And like the messages that you're spreading, because everyone who sees you wearing that costume doesn't necessarily have to speak to you and understand your reasoning behind it, but they're going to take away their own like lesson from it nonetheless. And so I think it's important to realize that like the intent isn't always going to matter, and like it's not always going to be seen that way by everyone else. So
Yeah, go ahead, Nia.
So Shauna, I thought you brought up like a very like interesting point about like how sort of nuanced the intent is, because one thing that was mentioned within the letter was the fact that she says like within the US itself this has become a large problem, whereas like in other countries it's not really a problem. Like she got a sari and she thought it was beautiful. We see a lot of tourists like wearing a lot of traditional costumes as a way to like embrace the culture, which I think is very interesting because that's typically not depicted as offensive. And I think it's very different because she says that Halloween, which is predominantly celebrated usually specifically only in the US, and then it originated from Ireland, I believe. And anyways, and she says it's sort of like devalue, like one of the words she used, I don't remember what it was, but what that sort of meant was to devalue certain authority figures. And I think it becomes very sensitive towards certain cultures because for such a long time they've been oppressed or made fun of for certain characteristics. I know one thing is like in TikTok there was like this fox eye trend that a lot of people were doing, which was very offensive towards Asians specifically, because that was something a lot of Asians were made fun of for a long time. And so I think that context makes it on a broader spectrum. And because she expanded outside the realm of Halloween, it gets very nuanced. And it doesn't specifically have to do anything with just Halloween itself. Because I feel like people outside of just Halloween can like wear those costumes without having any cultural semblance towards it, but still pay respects in order to embrace the culture, if that makes any sense for me.
Samina, go ahead.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think this idea of like, is Halloween the exception where we are allowed to, it's like when we're dressing up as other people, is that only on Halloween? And can we do it on other days? And this idea of like, like how prevalent is cultural appropriation, and like that example with like the fox eyes, like I'm thinking about like cornrows and like how like should white people be allowed to do that, and like where is the line drawn in terms of like a costume rather than like I don't know, like a daily routine.
Yeah, those are both great points, and I'm really glad that you brought those two up. Um, I guess as an extension of that, one question I have is, um, what is the extent, and I want to word this really carefully, but hopefully I get the idea across. What is the extent of the damage done when there are instances of cultural appropriation? Because I think this is a really central idea to this case study. Students of color, primarily Black students at Yale, said in response to this email that this is a direct quote, created space for violence to happen on campus. And so the idea that someone appropriating culture is like creating violence, whereas the professor who sent the email then responded, I don't think that this is creating violence. It might be inappropriate, but it's not violence. And so there's that debate. And I'm curious to hear from you guys what you think. Like, what is the impact of cultural appropriation? Max, go ahead.
I think it depends on your definition of cultural appropriation and how much you're going to take offense at what the definition is. For example, I had an old friend in elementary school and early middle school, and he kind of made some comments that you could tell he kind of culturally appropriated a group of people, but I still liked him. I think he was I knew he didn't have any malintent when he did it, and I knew he didn't think less of any other ethnic group of people. So when he made these cultural appropriations, namely about Indian people, and I'm half Indian, so took a little more offense at that. I just had to think and be like, okay, I know he isn't coming from a bad place. I know that what he's doing, I just either isn't with malintent, and I have to think about it as, am I going to take offense at this, or I'm just going to say, okay, he's being funny. I'm just going to roll with it and say, that's fine. That's his opinion of humor. We all have different kinds of humor. And I know that he doesn't actually believe that all Indians are like this, or that he was accurately representing the Indian population.
Bella, go ahead.
I think there's also this idea of like awareness. So if someone insults you or like your culture, if you can tell them like, hey, that's not cool, and then they learn from it, I think that's like not how you can fix cultural appropriation, but maybe how you could like make the situation better. And so like if they continue to insult like that person while being aware, I think that would also be like a level of cultural appropriation.
Yeah, that's a great point. Chris, do you want to add something?
I thought it was interesting what Max said when he said, I think he said something at the end where he talked about like properly representing a certain culture. And I think that inherently lies the problem with cultural appropriation in this case, which is, I don't know, I can't really speak to the violence that happened on the campus, but I do think it causes misinformation and then bias and stereotyping, because I think that within at least most of the costumes in this case, there was, or I assume that there was a decent amount of, or from the offensive costumes, there was a decent amount of stereotypical apparel, I would assume. And I don't think that really caused, maybe that caused violence, but I also think it creates false ideas about a certain people or race or demographic unfairly. So it's more of an ideology than like a violent belief.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I would even go so far as maybe to posit that there is no way to accurately represent a whole culture, group of people through a costume. I don't know if that resonates with any of you, or if you disagree, definitely share. But I think that's a really great point from Chris. One thing I wanted to bring up before we end is Erica references her husband Nicholas and his point that if someone wears something offensive, you should either, he says, look away or engage them in discussion about it. Do you think that conversation between students about topics as complicated and as challenging as identity are viable. Like, is that something that we can expect of college students? And if not, how can universities create that space? Ella, go ahead.
I don't know how I feel about that because, in my opinion, I think that the email that Yale and the administration, the one that they sent, I think one of its main purposes was to educate, and just saying that these minorities that felt offended by the costumes, like they have the responsibility to educate these people in these costumes while they're offended by it. I think that's unfair, and I think that's why the Yale email was pretty good.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and I think that it's one I've heard a lot, especially with all the momentum around Black Lives Matter right now, how Black people shouldn't be the ones who have to educate everyone at every little step. And I think that's an interesting point to bring up, definitely a perspective a lot of people have. And I think to introduce to this conversation the other side, which I'm still grappling with because I think they complicate each other, is that students really have if you're on a college campus with students from all over the country, you're going to have people with all different backgrounds. And in order to live together in a community, these difficult conversations need to happen between students who aren't going to understand how each other grew up. And so, like, maybe this instance isn't the best example of when a conversation would be the most appropriate, to Ella's point. But I do think, in my view, it's important to create the space for this type of conversations when you're living in a diverse community, or community more diverse than the one you grew up in. Does anybody else have any concluding thoughts? April, go ahead. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh, no, it's fine. It's fine. Okay.
All right. The one thing I would say is I think there's a fine line between being politically correct and kind of gatekeeping cultures. In a sense, like, I've been in this situation a lot because I've grown up mostly in the US. So when I go to India, interestingly, I feel like I'm the one in this position. But if there's a white person who's trying to imitate Indian culture or Indian customs, if they're doing it incorrectly, but they're doing their best, I don't think that's cultural appropriation. I think that's just them doing their best and not knowing. And how could they possibly be expected to know if they haven't been raised in that culture? Like, for me, the few times I go to India, which is maybe like once every 2 years, I don't really know the cultures that well there because I've lived in the US my entire life. But I don't think I'm in any way appropriating Indian culture if I get something wrong. I think I'm just making a mistake. And I think it's not up to me to say who can and who can't try to actually imitate Indian culture, right? Like, it's not up to me to tell some white person, you're not inherently Indian, so you can't do your best to represent Indian culture. I know people who are white who live in India and are much more educated about Indian customs than me. So I think it really just boils down to your education on it and your intent. And I know, and the school of thought about intent isn't the most popular one, but I genuinely believe that even if you know nothing about a culture, as long as you're doing your best, you're just being respectful. I think much more disrespectful would be to not try because you're trying to avoid cultural appropriation, and you end up actually disrespecting their culture by doing that.
That's such an interesting point. I really wish we had another hour to discuss this because the intent versus impact debate is such an interesting one. Maybe we'll do another session on that, but that was a great point. Does anybody else have concluding thoughts? I know, April, you were raising your hand before, and I don't know when Divya is going to pull us out of this breakout room, so trying to go fast, but if you want to share, definitely.
I just think, like, everyone has a responsibility to first, like, learn themselves, and, like, on one hand that requires, like, systemic education change, and that's, like, a totally different conversation, but it's important, like, right now to just learn about other cultures, communities, and then when someone does if you do something offensive and someone does confront you, it's also your responsibility to listen to their story, listen to their perspective, because like everyone comes from different backgrounds and you like respect that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's also a great point. Okay, I think we have, oh, maybe people already left. Okay, we can go back to the main session unless you guys have any final points. Okay, you guys were a great group. Thank you so much for participating. It's really great when everybody participates, so I'm really grateful for that. When we go back to the main room, if we have time, and any of you want to share a takeaway from this case study because the other group did a different one, there will be an opportunity for that. But thank you guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, let's see. So, I mean, now that we have Samina back, do you want to tell us a little bit what you guys are talking about in your breakout room?
Sure. Okay, so we were talking about cultural appropriation and Halloween costumes on college campuses, and whether or not, like basically we were talking about like the theme of like freedom of expression and censorship on college campuses, and where is the line drawn, especially like on Halloween. We were also just talking about like cultural appropriation in general and how you may wear a costume that is offensive to some like group of people when you're 7 years old, but it may be like it may go unnoticed, if that makes sense. And so thinking about that as well.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Samina. I think we have probably everyone back, and so we just want to do a quick share out. We had the Halloween costume group share a brief explanation of what you guys talked about. Does anyone from the Build a Wall group want to share what we talked about and a little bit about the case? Okay, Ebony, go ahead.
So in ours, there was a bridge and each club was allowed to present a logo they wanted to be pasted on the bridge. And the club chose to put up the statement, "Build the wall," and the president reacted condoning the people who vandalized afterwards, saying "Stop white supremacy," rather than condoning the club that actually put up the slogan. So we were talking about, did the president react in the right way, and where do you draw the line with protecting free speech but also creating an environment of equality and equity?
That was a good summary, Ebony. Good job. Does anybody have any other reflections they want to add? Eliza, I'm not sure if you want to add anything.
No, I think Samina gave a great overview of our breakout room. If anybody else wants to share, you can share quickly and then we'll just wrap up. Okay.
Okay. So then while we wrap up, I'm going to share my screen again. Here we go. Okay, so we want to hear first a recap of what we did today. We did some norm setting. We went into these 2 case studies, talked about the facts a little bit, and then had hopefully an interesting discussion on what the right decision was to be made and this tension between free speech and hate speech. And so we want to hear from you. What did you think? What did you like the most? What would you change? What did you learn?
And if we did another session on a related topic, what are you interested in learning more about?
Yeah, is that Chris? Go ahead.
I just think it would be interesting if we did another session on this to get a little more background information about like the college's past response to like hate speech, cultural appropriation, etc. Maybe if we just got a little more context, I think that could really energize or catalyze a great debate or a great discussion.
I like that. I know that in Mall UN we have those like policy briefings. Any LCM kids here will know. So maybe we need one of those for a case study. That's a great idea, Chris.
Ari, go ahead.
Something I was thinking about is I really appreciated how towards the end of the conversation, I was in the Build a Wall group. That didn't sound good. You know what I mean? We got to, it felt like we were on the verge of like getting to more nuances in the conversation between like what does free speech really mean and next time, even continuing this conversation about like if a group's identity is at risk and very violated through another group's actions, how is that group, like the victim group, going to feel supported in their participation like later on with the community, and will they really be able to, I guess, feel comfortable in the environment, like exercising freedom of speech if they feel violated at one point? So yeah, honestly, I just think we didn't have enough time. So making them longer.
That's great. Yeah, I think there's actually so much interesting research about that out there. So maybe we'll do another session, but that's good to hear. We weren't sure on timing how long we should make it, but that's good feedback.
It was great.
We're always hesitant to keep you guys on Zoom for a long time because anybody who's been doing Zoom school for the last semester knows that like tech fatigue is a thing. So hopefully this wasn't too long. So I guess on that, I know that it's about time to go, but we want to let you know that we have another seminar coming up on August 1st on gerrymandering, and we'll be having a guest speaker. And so if you're interested in more conversations like this and learning more specifically about the upcoming political election, this is going to be a great one. And if you're not already involved in Real Talk in some capacity, we really encourage you to check out our website and think about starting or joining a chapter of your own.
If you guys have any other thoughts or feedback on what we did today, definitely feel free to email us. There's the learnrealtalk@gmail.com email, or you all have Divya's email because she sent out the Zoom link. But we would love to hear from you about your experiences. We're trying to create a series of these and develop more. So very open to any thoughts that you have. Thank you for spending your Saturday afternoon doing this. I feel like I'm like an airline flight attendant. Like, we know you have a lot of options for how you want to spend your Saturday afternoon, but we are really glad you all came to be part of this discussion. Stay involved in Real Talk if it was interesting, and if you have more ideas, definitely reach out to us. Thanks, guys.
Bye,
Oh,
guys.
and if you have questions, feel free to stay on. Divya and I will stay if you guys have questions about Real Talk.
That we will.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Chris.
Good job, guys. That was so interesting.
Thanks, guys. Thank you for coming. We really appreciate it. Welcome. We are in breakout discussion room 2, and that means that we're going to be doing a case study on what we call build a wall. I'm going to share my screen for a second here. Okay, let's see. Okay, here we go. So I'm going to go over some case facts, and feel free to stop me at any time if you have any questions or any comments. So here's our case. The University of Minnesota has reserved places for clubs to post posters in the beginning of the year in an event called Paint the Bridge. So think about like clubs fair, people are coming into the beginning of school. And a Republican student group at the university used their reserved spot, which every club gets, to put a Build a Wall poster, which is, as I'm sure you're familiar, a central slogan for President Trump's campaign in 2016. Now, in response to that club's painting, many students at the University of Minnesota called the poster racist. And in response to that, the Republican clubs who originally posted the poster said that, or claimed that the posters were meant to not be racist, and they were just a policy statement. Next, we have student protesters who still believe that the posters are still racist, and they put graffiti on the words that say "Stop White Supremacy." And then the president of the school finally responds by saying, basically that people should not be vandalizing whatever someone has chosen to put on this bridge for their club. But that actually sparks more student outrage. And so in this conversation, we're going to be going over what were the actual different statements that were made, what should a president of the school actually have done, what would you have done if you were in that situation? Okay, to give you some context, here was the original bridge, and here was the graffiti after it was done. Does anybody have any questions? No? Okay. So before we started our conversation, I wanted to show you guys two of the letters that were sent in the process of this controversy that I think are really interesting to look at. The first one is from the Department of Chicano and Latino Studies that created a statement basically condoning the student clubs that had painted the Build a Wall poster. Does somebody want to read it out loud for everyone? So I'm not just like lecturing you guys. You can raise your hand if you want.
I can do it if you want.
That'd be awesome. Thanks.
Anti-immigrant and anti-Latinx rhetoric has figured prominently in the current presidential election. This speech was recycled in the University of Minnesota's annual Paint the Bridge event when a registered student organization adopted Donald Trump's slogan, Build the Wall. We write to express our outrage at the xenophobia. We are advocates of freedom of speech, but we consider this statement to reflect more than just a preference for one political candidate over another. It is a barely covert racist message that explicitly targets Mexican nationals. Stated as a command, it does not represent free speech so much as it creates a threatening and hostile environment for immigrants, documented or undocumented. Anyone of Mexican descent and anyone subject to racial profiling. This incident reflects growing anti-Latinx rhetoric and it's arguably an example of hate speech.
Awesome, thanks, Ayana. So to kind of summarize, the department is saying that inherently that the poster is racist because of the things and the slogans that it is associated with. Now, this was the response from President Kaler. Does someone else want to read this out loud? Thanks, Catherine. Go ahead.
Anytime. Dear Twin Cities campus community, during the annual Paint the Bridge event, an opportunity for registered student groups and university departments to promote their groups by painting a panel on the Washington Avenue Bridge. One panel assigned to a student group has received attention. The panel includes the phrase from Donald Trump's presidential campaign, Build the Wall. While this is protected as free political speech, we have heard from members of our community who find the phrase hurtful, offensive, anti-immigrant, and anti-Latinx. People in our community may disagree with the sentiment expressed. However, while the university values free speech, the subsequent vandalism of the panel is not the way to advance a conversation. The University of Minnesota supports a campus climate that welcomes all members of our community and our values of equity and diversity, but that also ensures the free flow of ideas, even those that are offensive to some. As students in our community participate in responses to this and future issues, I urge all of us to be respectful and thoughtful in our approach. We encourage all who find some protected speech distasteful or offensive to engage in more protected speech.
Perfect, thanks, Catherine. And so to summarize that one, he's essentially acknowledging the different controversies and feelings from different communities on campus, but eventually saying that no one should have vandalized the bridge as it is either way. So I'm going to show these discussion questions for you. The first thing we're going to talk about is what are 3 to 5 different interpretations a student could have had about President Kaler's statement. And let me know if you guys want me to keep that on the slide, but if possible, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can see each other, and I'll put these questions in the chat. But I just wanted to open up any initial thoughts. What are you thinking about right now? Yeah, go ahead, Ayana.
Well, I think when I first read it, it struck me as kind of relating to the Black Lives Matter movement in a different, not completely parallel, but I think it reminded me a lot that a lot of times people take their frustration out in vandalism, or they show their emotions through violence or whatever, and a lot of times it's not the right answer. But I also think that there are definitely 2 sides to this story, especially because the president of the school has to be very nonpartisan and look at both sides. And I think for me, while everything can be handled better than vandalism or violence, but I also think that it's really valid, the other side. So I think this is a really, really great example of like real talk and just, seeing both sides from different lenses. So I thought this one was very prevalent, but I also think that there's two sides to it, if that makes sense.
Thanks for sharing that, Ayana. I definitely agree. Something that I'm a little bit iffy about is I don't know what I think about President Kaler's statement back. I like the fact that he acknowledged the fact that different student groups were angry about it. But I'm wondering if you guys think that the slogan "Build a Wall" is inherently racist.
Well, I think that.
Rachel, why don't you go then, Sally? You can go afterwards.
Oh, well, after everything that's happened in recent years since the 2016 election, the whole campaign and people on it have become somewhat synonymous with racism and xenophobic sentiments. So it's kind of hard to avoid that message when you use something so closely associated with the campaign. But I do believe that the students did have a right to express their political opinions in a visual form like that. I personally don't think that was a very appropriate thing to put in a public place on a school though, but I don't see like how you could kind of prevent them from doing that.
Yeah, I was going to say something pretty similar. I think something I've been thinking about is like, when does it become more than just a political opinion? Because I think when you say something like "build a wall," that holds a lot more weight than like having a political conversation around like immigration reform or things like that. And I think when you say a slogan that is known to be like politically and racially and emotionally charged like that, it becomes more than just a statement of like, oh, we have different political opinions.
Okay, then let me pose a hypothetical for you guys. Let's say that instead of the phrase being "build a wall," it had been "make America great again." I'm not sure if that's better or worse. Would anything have changed? Yeah, go ahead, Ayana. You guys can raise your hand or just keep talking.
Okay, I'm not sure this completely answers your question, but I think a lot of times, like, some things can make people uncomfortable, and I think for the majority, like, that whole like Trump Pence side in the middle between the other two, like build a wall thing, might not have made people as uncomfortable. Like, yeah, they might be like, oh, like that's like, why would someone put that up? But it's also a Republican like club, and so I think you can kind of assume that they would probably like Trump. And so I think the political slogan is probably not what made them uncomfortable. I think if it was "Make America Great Again," it wouldn't have as big of an impact, because now that I think about it more, like saying "build a wall," like I completely agree with their letter. It does make it seem like we don't want the people of Mexican nationality, because the wall, we all know the wall is between Mexico and the United States. So I think because it was that certain thing, and we know what Trump says about the wall, I think that's what caused it. And I don't know if another political statement, like just a slogan, would have been as triggering for some people.
That's a great point, Ayana. Thanks for sharing. Pip, I feel like you're thinking about something. No pressure, but do you want to share?
I mean, okay, I was just thinking about what Siley said about when it becomes more than just a political statement. And I was trying to think about the difference between "build a wall" and "Make America Great Again." And I think that maybe "build a wall" ties more directly, or you can't like hear that phrase without associating it with like preventing immigration from Mexico, whereas "Make America Great Again," maybe, I don't know if I even agree with what I'm saying right now, but maybe it's more distanced from the like prevention of like immigration, or like what, like some of the things that Trump's campaign I don't know if that makes sense, but
yeah,
like I think it doesn't explicitly discriminate against students as much as "Build a Wall" might.
Yeah, I guess what you're bringing up for me is that what if the phrase had been like, "We need immigration reform"? Is that better, or is that inherently, or like we need to keep out illegal immigrants? What if that had been the phrase?
Yeah, I think like that would be like more connected to like hurting. It would maybe hurt students like at the school more than like build a wall, which might hurt them more than make America great again. I don't know. I feel like there's varying degrees of like how explicitly it's discriminating against students at the school. No matter, like, I know all of those are political statements, but like maybe there's a range.
Yeah, Ari.
Yeah, I agree with Pip in many ways. I think that the statement immigration reform like invites more dialogue between different groups on campus, whereas Make America Great Again or Build a Wall is very dividing. Physically, the wall is dividing, but it also closes up a lot of space for conversation and real talk between different group school organizations, because that can invite more conversation and create, I think, a more inclusive space, because it doesn't feel like as harsh and violent of a statement that the Build a Wall statement inherently carries based on Trump's campaign.
Okay, yeah, all right, I definitely see what you're saying in that, like, just certain phrases are just emotionally charged, right? And we have to be pretty aware of that. And so, obviously, we saw the way that President Kaler responded, and he actually ended up condoning the students who vandalized the posters. What did you guys think of that? Would you have responded in the same way? Like, how would you have felt if you were a student on the University of Minnesota campus? Yeah, Jacob.
It as easy as it would be to get angry. The message that was said, like, you need to stop white supremacy, like, that's not, I don't think many people would disagree with that message. Just the way that it was carried out was the issue. And as much as I would want to have like the university, like the president of the university, be extremely harsh on the people that had the Build a Wall stuff on the bridge, it isn't fair to the rest of the people, and it wouldn't make them feel comfortable. And yeah, sorry, but it's just not fair to the rest of the people. And as much as you want to just say that your way is the right way, then there's not going to be any progress, and it's just going to keep on being arguments, and nobody's going to get anything out from the confrontation.
I completely see what you're saying, Jacob. It's almost like the sentiment was in the right place in terms of trying to, I'm not sure start a dialogue is the right term, but they were trying to address it. Maybe graffiti wasn't the correct way to do it. I guess what I was thinking in my head is like, what if it was the flip situation and there was, for example, like an Obama Hope poster, and someone graffitied over it. I feel like that in itself could be seen as hate speech.
Yeah. Something interesting is when you look at the flip situation, I'm not sure it would be like a complete accurate comparison, just because of like, I guess who you're targeting. Because generally when I've seen like graffiti over like something to do with Obama, it's somehow usually ends up like targeting a specific group or being hateful in some way. And I think graffitiing over something that could be interpreted as hateful with a statement that's like not inherently hateful is a different situation.
That's a good point. So is there something inherently different about the phrase "Make America Great Again" that's different than any other campaign slogan? That's a good question, Siley. Because I think that's what Siley is getting at, and that like the phrase itself is so emotionally charged and possibly racist that it couldn't even really be considered a policy. Lindsay, I feel like you're thinking about something. Do you want to share? No pressure.
Sure. I mean, I'm thinking about something that we looked at as a club earlier in the year, and it was, I'm just assuming most of you haven't seen this, so I'm just going to explain it quickly. Sorry for those of you who have. But there was an incident at Middlebury college where they brought in a Republican student group, brought in a speaker who was like a pretty explicitly a white supremacist, and who just like believed in the inherent supremacy of white people and men. And so there was like a lot of backlash against that from teachers and students, and like ultimately an apology, I think, from the administration. And I think just in like thinking about this, I just like wonder, and I think in part like this just has to do with maybe like where the Republican Party is today, but how can we separate like build a wall and make America great again from like ideas of white supremacy? And like I sort of understand what people are saying about how explicit the message is, but I think all of those policies or like ideas are based in white supremacy. So I just like wonder, I think that for me would be like the difference between a poster that says "Make America Great Again" versus like an Obama, I don't know, a different poster, I guess, that wasn't based in those same ideas and policies.
So then on that note, Lindsay, do you think that President Kaler responded in the right way? If you were in his shoes, like what would you have done?
I mean, I think that so I'm not looking at the message, but like acknowledged that it was offensive in some way.
Yeah.
I mean, I think with that acknowledgement, like I'm not sure that his sort of condoning these posters was a way of protecting all the students on campus.
Yeah, Ari.
I think that if I remember correctly in the response, he had said, like, we're a school who stands on the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I do feel like that's incredibly hypocritical in condoning the build a wall statement and only kind of giving punishment to the students who put "Stop White Supremacy" over it. Because I also think in terms of like the positionality piece, the campaign that Trump runs on and the students who are perpetuating like the racist ideology that he runs on and believes in is always, or has been and still is today, like much more, carries a lot more weight and power. I think like historically these people to say that statement and then get away with it versus students who really believe in diversity, equity, and inclusion work and want to dismantle white supremacy, like that just feels like it's not, we can't equate the two things based on the power that the two groups hold and have held throughout history.
Sure, Pip, you go ahead.
I was thinking that, like, by putting up, I was thinking about, like, how if the Republican student group wanted to put up their message, like, what they support, then maybe putting it on this, like, paint a bridge thing isn't the way to do it, because by, like, putting it in such a, like, saying, like, build a wall in such a visual and, like, public space, I feel like that's going to create a response of some sort of backlash, because it is a very strong political statement that has an association with like keeping immigrants from coming in, so which then has an effect on students at that school. So I think that like if they did want to put that message out, putting it in such a public space and then having the president condone the students who like vandalized it is kind of unfair, because like when something is so emotionally charged, I feel like there's bound to be a response to that.
Sally, did you want to add on to that?
Yeah, this is kind of adding on with more clarity to what I said earlier. I think it would have been like a totally different situation if it was a slogan for like, in my opinion, I think like a lot of other Republican presidents, or like I don't think it's necessarily about, oh, like if you say something to do with like being Republican or your Republican ideologies, that's inherently hateful, but like Trump specifically is known for a lot of like anti-minority rhetoric. So I think
specifically because of him and what he's known to say and do, it's a different situation than just talking politics.
Okay, so I guess a little bit of what I'm hearing is that is supporting Trump inherently a political statement that could offend people's identities? And that, like, let's say instead of the poster or Paint the Bridge saying "Make America Great Again," it just said Trump Pence 2016. Would then that still be hate speech? Would that still be, do you think that would still make people on campus uncomfortable? And if it does, should an administration or dean person say that that's not okay? I know these are not easy questions. I don't know the answer either, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Yeah, Catherine.
So I think that most college campuses right now generally lean liberal, as a trend we're seeing right now. I do think that that sort of campaign poster could make people nervous or make people anxious, but I really think that it would be borderline censorship and not okay for the university to take down all of those posters, just because I think that you hit a really slippery slope when signs and messages that offend certain groups of people are forbid in general, just because I think that that's really not a concrete thing to base decisions off of. And so tying that back into the poster that said "Build a Wall," even though personally I think that's a really horrible statement, I do agree with the president of the university, because I think that there's no explicit message of harm to groups of immigrants. There's definitely maybe an implicit message of bias or hate, but I think that once we start dealing with implicit signals, everyone can find something that's maybe implicitly offensive about lots of different statements.
Catherine, I think it's really interesting that you brought up precedent, right? Because it almost reminds me of, like, it's kind of like legal jargon in a sense, but it's almost like this decision will set the tone for many other things in the future. And so by making this one decision, or by the dean choosing one thing, what is he saying about other examples? That's a great point. Does anybody agree, disagree? Yes, Eiley.
I mean, I see that, and I also think it's important to think about, like, implicit, like, racism and hate, and, like, generally implicit, like, oppression still have a lot of effects. Like, and I think we see this a lot. Like, I've been thinking about it a lot with, like, the Black Lives Matter movement, and I think, like, racism and hate, like, run deeper in this country than what you can see, like, explicitly. So while I see the point of, like, oh, you can't censor, it's also, like, I don't think you can say, like, it's only racism if it's explicit, because then you're disregarding a lot of the roots of what we see in our country.
Okay. Let's see, I'm trying to think of a different example where something would be implicit. But let's take the example that instead of talking about a slogan on a wall, we were talking about a specific policy reform. Maybe it was a law, and maybe it's commonly associated with being anti-immigrant. Maybe let's just say it's something that creates a quota system, or let's just take the Muslim ban, and it's supporting that policy. Would we say that having a poster about that would not be allowed on campus, even though it's not a slogan? It's a law. Does that make a difference? Or is it because we think it's implicitly racist, would that not be okay? Let me know if I need to rephrase that or if that's confusing. Yeah, Lindsay, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is a direct answer to your question. I guess this is building off what Siley said, but I think it might be just, like, really difficult, like, to separate, like, politics from, like, racism and, like, generally, like, xenophobia. Like, I think I wonder with, like, having totally open, like, political discourse, like, then are we allowing for, like, the sort of condoning of, like, xenophobic policies? I don't know. I have, like, a hard time, I guess, separating, like, what is okay, like, political discussion when, like, politics, like, especially, like, today, but always like tend to include like sorry, I'm not doing a great job of phrasing this, but like when the discussions are happening around like racist policy, like how can we protect, like how can colleges protect all students and still allow totally open, free flow of discussion around those things?
Lindsay, I think what you're getting at is really like the crux of the issue. It's how do we have like political discourse and open conversations while at the same time creating spaces where all students feel included, right? And where do we draw the line where political discourse starts to offend people to the point where they don't feel safe anymore? And so I guess in this case, we saw the letter from the Department of Latino Studies, and they clearly expressed that they had been personally offended by the statements made. Is that in itself, should that have just been what the dean, should that have framed the dean's actions more? I guess what I'm saying is like, if he is not a person of color or a person who would have been personally affected by the statement, does he have the right to say that they shouldn't have been vandalized? His acknowledging his own positionality?
I think as a president of a college, it is his responsibility to listen to the teachers and the students who feel offended by things like this. And based off of his letter, it seemed like his response was more passive and he didn't really encourage any immediate action, because if students feel that white supremacy is a thing on their campus, that is a very serious thing and a valid concern. And that seems like something the school administration should put more effort into addressing than just a memo like that.
Okay, Rich, I'm going to push you a little bit more on this one. So as the president, he has to respond, a responsibility one to the Department of Latino Studies. But let's say he also has a responsibility to Republican students on campus, and specifically the Republican club that put up that poster. What is he going to say to them when they tell him you are restricting my political speech?
Well, that's a part that I'm kind of stuck on, because I don't think he has the ability to just tell them, no, you can't put this or anything up as long as it's like supporting a political belief, because that is protected. But I think it's important for him to encourage some kind of dialogue or some way that maybe these two sides can come together and discuss this more. And I'm not sure if that would change much though, because it seems like both sides are very rooted in their opinions, but at least it would show like he is concerned and he's trying to do something.
Well, I mean, that Republican group did come out and say that the statement was not racist. Does that make a difference?
I think that intent is very important, but when you put up something like that that says build a wall, I don't think that is solely to promote your club. You had to have some idea that this could provoke a response from people who would be offended.
Jordan, I see you nodding. Is there anything you wanted to add?
I personally agree about how important it is about the intent, because I do think that intent, I know legally it is important, but also like if they meant to do harm by that, then I think that that should be like considered hate speech. But if they are trying to do like a political statement, although it does have some sort of tie to certain hate speech and it can be seen as offensive, I think that should also be taken into consideration. Yeah, that's my reaction to that, I guess.
Yeah, so I think what we're also getting at is a different conversation about intent versus action. If people's intents were not necessarily racist, does that still make the act racist or not? Ruby, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think intent does matter, but I think the act, like, doesn't make the act not racist, even if their intent was, I guess, like, good or neutral. But I think there's also some responsibility that the club had to, if others were speaking out and saying that it could be interpreted as hate speech, like the message they put on the painting, that I think they had some responsibility to maybe apologize or even just like change their like painting to a different slogan if they saw, because if their intent was good, wouldn't they do that?
Great point. Yeah, Catherine.
I agree. I do think that the action matters a lot. It's not just the intent. And to me, that really shows the need for these two groups to have a way to have some conversations on college campuses, because I think that if the university did nothing to respond to these this Republican club, those political and maybe racist beliefs of these different members are not going to go away. And maybe some of these members don't really realize that these political statements have very racially charged undertones. And so I think that while those conversations are going to be very hard, college is a great place to listen to people that are not like you at all, politically, racially, and to learn from those interactions.
Yeah. That's a great point, Catherine. And what that makes me wonder is, obviously this is not black and white, right? There's a spectrum of the different types of actions that administration could have taken. And I guess the question I have is, what responsibility did the college have? Obviously, what President Kaler took was an approach where he's like, I'm going to condone the graffiti. One step further than that would have been to either punish the graffitiers or punish the club that originally put the statement up. Do you think that any students deserve to have repercussions?
I guess I don't really think that it would be fair to punish either side, because both of them were really just exercising their right to freedom of speech. I do think they need to do more to address the topic of white supremacy in their school. But I don't think punishing either side would be fair or really effective in this situation.
Yeah, Jacob.
I don't think the information was provided, but like, do they have to clear what they're going to be putting on the bridge with like the administration? Because if so, like, I would assume that somebody in the administration would talk to the Republican group and like express to them that this, like, the message they're about to put on the bridge is like racially, emotionally charged. So I think that the administration could have at least had some like checks in place to see what they're going to be putting up on the bridge. I mean, that would make the most sense to me as a way to like prevent that to from happening in the future.
Okay, so Jacob, I see what you're saying. So you're thinking that it would be best so there's kind of a check before posters are put up. I'm wondering, do you think that's maybe a form of censorship? I'm not saying yes or no, but I'm wondering what you think.
Possibly. I think that the Republican group, they should have at least known what they were putting up. And to answer your question, yes, it could be censorship. Yes. Yeah.
But something I do wonder is, would the group have been received differently if they had put the poster up and then at the same time released a statement, like something like we acknowledge the fact that this slogan is associated with this and this and that it has recent stones. Why we believe this needs to have a place here is because of the following reasons. I'm not sure if that would have even been very valid, but I wonder if that would have changed anything.
Are you asking me or?
No, I'm just commenting. Yeah, rather go ahead. But if you want to add, you can.
It to a certain extent, it would have changed the perception of the. Yes and no, because while you are giving an explanation, it still doesn't like erase the fact that that message has those emotional and racial. Sorry, what's the word? It's like charged racially and emotionally. So
yeah, I see what you're saying.
Give it to a certain extent, but it still doesn't excuse the fact.
Yeah, Radha, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. But I feel like if they had like coupled their painting with like a statement, it could have invited a little more constructive conversation out of like their painting on the bridge, because what like happened in that whole like interaction was just like both of them painting on the same like place. Like it wasn't super constructive at all, and it just ended in like a lot of like people who were very angry on the campus. So I feel like if they had released a statement, it would have kind of set up the path for a more constructive way for like the people who like wanted to vandalize, obviously because they were felt targeted, for them to be a little for it to be like become a little more constructive like conversation, I guess.
Yeah, right. I think that is the question. Like, how do you take something like this and make it constructive? And I guess a plan of action that I could have seen the university taking is saying, we're not going to have any political speech shown on this bridge. Do you guys think that would have been a better decision? Yeah, Pip.
I don't know exactly how to answer that in all honesty, but I do think that the fact that they vandalized the political statement means that that discussion needed to happen at some point, and like Radha said, like the only way they were able to kind of communicate was through that vandalizing. But I think that that kind of just signifies that like campus needed real talk, or like they needed like some sort of way to communicate better. I don't know if that makes sense.
No. So that's a good point. And I guess focusing on how students who are outraged responded. If not graffiti, what should they have done? I'm not sure. Lucy, did you want to add? Oh, Lucy, do you want to add anything? I'm not sure if you're there or not. And no pressure.
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, hey.
Yeah, I think they could have like put out a statement like saying why it was offensive to them, like, and send it to the Republican Club, like all the other students, because maybe the Republican Club didn't understand why it was like racially charged or why it was xenophobic.
Well, we did see the Latino Studies Department release that statement, and clearly that although that reached President Kaler, it didn't ultimately affect his decision, right? Do you think that was effective?
I don't really know how to answer your question, but yeah, I think that statement.
That's okay.
Yeah, I don't really have any more thoughts about that.
No, that's okay. That's okay. Thanks, Lucy. Catherine, did you want to add anything?
I was gonna say, I was wondering, I'm not sure if there just wasn't a ton of space on this bridge, but I think in an ideal situation, the dissenting group could have put up their own posters next to the posters of the other group, just because, I mean, if all political speech is okay, then they have a right to show their contradictory opinion without, however, silencing completely the opinion that they are fighting against.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Catherine. And I wonder, I haven't seen the whole wall, but I wonder if there were like other political posters like that. Lindsay, do you have your hand raised? I didn't. No. Jacob, did you have your hand raised? I keep seeing it. No. Okay. Okay, so then let's move on to kind of an action-oriented thing. If you were President Kaler, what is the statement you would have released and what action would you have taken? Ruby? We raised your hand. Sorry.
No, I was just flexing my wrist. Sorry.
Oh, no, you're fine. Yeah, Pip, go ahead.
I probably wouldn't have punished either group, but I would have maybe offered support for the Latinx group and said like if like our school does stand, I forget if they did this in the letter, but they say like our school does value diversity, equity, inclusion, and like we support our Latinx students like as an institution.
Yeah. Why don't we take a look at the letter really quickly? Okay. Is this sharing? Okay. The Dear Twin Cities thing, right? Okay. So it says, the panel includes the phrase from Donald Trump's presidential campaign, Build the Wall. While this is protected as free political speech, we have heard from members of our community who find the phrase hurtful, offensive, anti-immigrant, and anti-Latinx. People in our community may disagree with the sentiment expressed. However, while the university values free speech, the subsequent vandalism of the panel is not the way to advance a conversation. And so he goes on to say that they value equity and diversity, but they also ensure the free flow of ideas, even those that are offensive to some. So what do we think about that? Do we think that certain offensiveness is different than others? So in this case, it's offending people on the basis of race, right? But I think what he's saying in general is that no matter what, most things that you say will offend someone. And so is there something different about that case? And if so, what is it? Is he oversimplifying it by saying that, there's going to be lots of free speech and some things are going to offend people? Yeah, Radha, go ahead.
I feel like I've kind of heard this a lot on especially from an older generation, just you guys are very sheltered, you only it's kind of like an echo, you hear what you want, exactly what you like to hear back almost, especially on college campuses, people really feel like they're a bubble of people having the same ideas and not many of your beliefs being tested. So I feel like he was maybe trying to get at that, you're going to hear a lot of things you don't like in your life, and you should be ready for that. But I feel like in his one memo where he addressed this problem, it probably wasn't the place to say that, just because he should have maybe, I don't know, had more substantial things to say, you guys can organize a protest or have an actual dialogue, maybe not you guys are very sheltered almost.
Yeah, I almost wonder if there's a statement from the Latino Studies Department in response to the letter. I wasn't able to find one of those, but I think that would be interesting to look at. And so I think we're going to probably go back into the main group soon. Oh, Sahana, I see you turned your camera on. Is there something you wanted to say?
Just referring back to your previous question, I think that it's all about circumstance when it comes to offensiveness, because if you say something like, I like chocolate, and someone's like, I'm offended because I like vanilla, that's obviously a lot different than saying something like Make America Great Again. And I feel like when someone is offended by someone questioning a part of their identity, like racism or religion or ethnicity, there's almost a gray area in which if someone is targeting and making you feel uncomfortable about something that centers your identity, it should be unacceptable.
Yeah, well, I think that's the crux of the issue. And I know this discussion probably feels a little bit uncomfortable and probably tough because there doesn't seem like to be a very, very clear right answer. I know that bothers me too, but I think that's the decision we're going to have to start making on a case-to-case basis, especially with the current political climate. There's no doubt going to be more cases like this we're going to see in the upcoming fall. And the real question is going to be, where do we draw the line between open, free political discourse and creating an environment where all identities are both included and welcomed? So I think with that, oh, all right, did you have one last thought? And then I'm going to close the breakout rooms.
No, it's okay. We can close it up.
Okay, I'm going to close the rooms. Okay, I'll see you guys in the main session. Welcome back, guys. Hopefully both breakout discussions were interesting. Hopefully you'll be excited to hear what the different groups talked about, because there are two different case studies. So we're going to share a little bit. This 1 minute timer is always a weird thing as people come in on different times.
Yeah, I clicked on it immediately.
I can tell you're the only one from.
Oh my God, it was really great. I wasn't trying to anyway.
Okay, let's see. So, I mean, now that we have Samina back, do you want to tell us a little bit what you guys are talking about in your breakout room?
Sure. Okay, so we were talking about cultural appropriation and Halloween costumes on college campuses, and whether or not like basically we're talking about like the theme of like freedom of expression and censorship on college campuses, and where is the line drawn, especially like on Halloween. We were also just talking about like cultural appropriation in general, and how you may wear a costume that is offensive to some like group of people when you're 7 years old, but it may be like, it may go unnoticed, if that makes sense. And so thinking about that as well.
Thanks for sharing that, Samina. I think we have probably everyone back, and so we just want to do a quick share out. We had the Halloween costume group share a brief explanation of what you guys talked about. Does anyone from the Build a Wall group want to share what we talked about and a little bit about the case? Okay, Ebony, go ahead.
So in ours, there was a bridge and each club was allowed to present a logo they wanted to be pasted on the bridge. And the club chose to put up the statement, "Build the wall." And the president reacted, condoning the people who vandalized afterwards, saying, "Stop white supremacy," rather than condoning the club that actually put up the slogan. So we were talking about, did the president react in the right way? And where do you draw the line with protecting free speech, but also creating an environment of equality and equity?
That was a good summary, Ebony. Good job. Does anybody have any other reflections they want to add? Eliza, I'm not sure if you want to add anything.
No, I think Samina gave a great overview of our breakout room. If anybody else wants to share, you can share quickly and then we'll just wrap up.
Okay. So then while we wrap up, I'm going to share my screen again. Here we go. Okay, so we want to hear first a recap of what we did today. We did some norm setting. We went into these 2 case studies, talked about the facts a little bit, and then had hopefully an interesting discussion on what the right decision was to be made and this tension between free speech and hate speech. And so we want to hear from you. What did you think? What did you like the most? What would you change? What did you learn?
And if we did another session on a related topic, what are you interested in learning more about?
Yeah, is that Chris? Go ahead.
I just think it would be interesting if we did another session on this to get a little more background information about like the college's past response to like hate speech, cultural appropriation, etc. Maybe if we just got a little more context, I think that could really energize or catalyze a great debate. Or
I like that. I know that in Mall UN we have those like policy briefings. Any LCM kids here will know. So maybe we need one of those for a case study. That's a great idea, Chris.
Ari, go ahead.
Something I was thinking about is I really appreciated how towards the end of the conversation, I was in the Build a Wall group. That didn't sound good. You know what I mean? We got to, it felt like we were on the verge of like getting to more nuances in the conversation between like, what does free speech really mean? And next time, even continuing this conversation about like, if a group's identity is at risk and very violated through another group's actions, how is that group, like the victim group, going to feel supported in their participation like later on with the community? And will they really be able to, I guess, feel comfortable in the environment, like exercising freedom of speech if they feel violated at one point? So yeah, honestly, I just think we didn't have enough time. So making them longer.
That's great. Yeah, I think there's actually so much interesting research about that out there. So maybe we'll do another session, but that's good to hear. We weren't sure on timing how long we should make it, but that's good feedback.
It was great.
We're always hesitant to keep you guys on Zoom for a long time because anybody who's been doing Zoom school for the last semester knows that like tech fatigue is a thing. So hopefully this wasn't too long. So I guess on that, I know that it's about time to go, but we want to let you know that we have another seminar coming up on August 1st on gerrymandering, and we'll be having a guest speaker. And so if you're interested in more conversations like this and learning more specifically about the upcoming political election, this is going to be a great one. And if you're not already involved in Real Talk in some capacity, we really encourage you to check out our website and think about starting or joining a chapter of your own.
If you guys have any other thoughts or feedback on what we did today, definitely feel free to email us. There's the learnrealtalk@gmail.com email, or you all have Divya's email because she sent out the Zoom link. But we would love to hear from you about your experiences. We're trying to create a series of these and develop more. So very open to any thoughts that you have. Thank you for spending your Saturday afternoon doing this. I feel like I'm like an airline flight attendant. Like, we know you have a lot of options for how you want to spend your Saturday afternoon, but we are really glad you all came to be part of this discussion. Stay involved in Real Talk if it was interesting, and if you have more ideas, definitely reach out to us. Thanks, guys.
Bye, guys.
Oh, and if you have questions, feel free to stay on. Divya and I will stay if you guys have questions about Real Talk.
That we will.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.